The sun was merciless, beating down on the endless stretch of sand that shimmered like molten glass. She stumbled forward, every step heavier than the last, her body trembling with exhaustion. Her throat was so dry it felt like it had been carved from stone, and each breath rasped in her chest like fire. She had been walking for hours, maybe days, it was hard to tell anymore. The desert swallowed time, just as it seemed ready to swallow her. Her legs finally gave way, and she collapsed into the burning sand, the heat searing her skin. Dust clung to her cracked lips as she tried to whisper, but no sound came out. Images of her past life flickered faintly in her mind, faces of people who had once promised to love her, the laughter she thought would last forever, the dreams she had held so tightly. All of it felt like another lifetime, unreachable now. She was alone, abandoned, discarded in a place where even the wind seemed cruel. For a moment, she thought about closing her eyes and letting the desert claim her, because what was left to fight for? But a single spark inside her resisted. With trembling hands, she pressed her palms against the hot earth, trying to rise, but her body refused. Tears that wouldn't come burned behind her eyes, and with the last of her strength, she whispered a broken prayer into the emptiness, not knowing if anyone, or anything, was listening. Somewhere deep down, she still hoped. The horizon wavered in the heat, a blur of gold and dust stretching endlessly. She lay motionless in the sand, her body fragile as if it could vanish with the next gust of wind. Then, faintly at first, there was a sound, the steady rhythm of hooves striking the earth. A lone figure approached, his silhouette outlined against the blazing sun. He was a cowboy, his wide-brimmed hat shielding his face, his presence cutting through the desolation like a promise of hope. As he drew closer, his eyes caught the faint rise and fall of her chest. Without a second thought, he swung down from his horse and hurried to her side. Her skin was hot to the touch, her lips cracked, her breath shallow. He knelt in the sand, the grit sticking to his jeans, and gently lifted her head. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice calm yet urgent. From his saddlebag, he pulled a canteen and pressed it to her lips, tilting it carefully so a trickle of cool water slid into her mouth. She stirred, her eyelids fluttering, as if clinging to the sound of his voice. "Don't give up," he whispered, brushing the dust from her cheek. With strong, practiced hands, he lifted her into his arms and carried her to his horse. Settling her carefully in the saddle, he climbed up behind her, holding her steady. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, but for the first time in days, she wasn't alone. Somewhere inside her fading spirit, hope flickered back to life. The desert night fell cold and wide, a sky scattered with stars so sharp they seemed to pierce the darkness. The cowboy had built a small fire, its glow casting long shadows over the dunes. She lay wrapped in his warm coat, its weight and warmth a shield against the chill. Her body still trembled from exhaustion, but she was alive, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't afraid. He sat nearby, tending the flames, his hat tipped low, the crackle of burning wood the only sound between them. When she stirred, he offered her a piece of bread and a sip of broth from a tin cup. She hesitated, her hands shaking as she took it. "Why are you helping me?" she whispered, her voice rough, broken from thirst and silence. He glanced at her, his eyes steady beneath the brim of his hat. "Because no one deserves to be left behind," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious truth in the world. She studied him in the firelight, the lines of his face worn by sun and years, yet softened by kindness. No one had looked at her that way in so long, not with pity, not with judgment, but with quiet respect. For the first time in years, she felt like more than the mistakes that had led her here. Wrapped in his coat, listening to the crackle of the fire and the steady breath of his horse nearby, she closed her eyes. For the first time in forever, she felt safe. The morning sun spilled over the desert, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold as the cowboy led his horse toward a sprawling valley. She stirred awake, her body sore but steadier than the night before. What she saw ahead made her breath catch, rolling green pastures, tall fences stretching wide, and horses galloping freely across open fields. It was a world she never imagined could exist beyond the barren wasteland she had been left in. As they passed through a wooden gate, ranch hands paused their work, tipping their hats respectfully to the cowboy. Some called out greetings, their voices carrying a warmth that surprised her. She turned her head to look at him, confusion flickering in her tired eyes. They all know you," she said softly. He smiled faintly, helping her down from the horse with steady hands. "This is your home?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief as she took in the vast ranch house, the barns, the herds that stretched as far as she could see. He gave a small nod, his boots crunching against the gravel. "It's where I've built my life," he said, almost reluctant. Then, as though sensing her unspoken question, he added quietly, "I've been fortunate. Some folks call it wealthy. But money doesn't mean much if you don't use it for something that matters." She stared at him, stunned, not just by the land, or his quiet revelation, but by the way he carried it all with such humility. For the first time, she realized he wasn't just her rescuer. He was a man whose strength wasn't measured in riches, but in the way he chose to live. The days that followed felt like a dream she was afraid to wake from. At first, she could barely walk without leaning on him, but little by little, strength returned to her body. The ranch became more than shelter, it became a place of renewal. She watched the sun rise over the fields, felt the steady rhythm of hooves on the ground, and breathed air that no longer carried despair. Every moment whispered a truth she had almost forgotten: she was still alive, and her life could still matter. One evening, as they stood by the corral, she turned to him with tears welling in her eyes. "You saved me," she said, her voice breaking. "But it feels like you gave me more than my life back." He looked at her, his weathered face softening into a smile. "I didn't give you anything you didn't already have," he said gently. "You just needed someone to remind you." In that moment, she realized he hadn't just rescued her from the desert, he had pulled her from the loneliness and despair that had weighed on her for years. His wealth, his land, his quiet power, it all mattered far less than the kindness he had shown when she was at her lowest. As the stars appeared overhead, she knew she had been transformed, not by fortune, but by compassion. Sometimes, the richest hearts wore dust and boots, and sometimes salvation came not in grand gestures, but in the simple choice to care. And that choice had changed everything.